Brady, thanks for your time. I thought it'd be good to get you on to tell us a little bit about Zone 2 because it's something like many recreational runners I've heard a ton about. It's got this vague mythology around it of you just need to do a ton of slow running and you'll speed up and you'll become a better runner. Something almost seductive about that, but there's probably some interesting issues we could dig into there. Why don't we start? You just tell me what are these zones and specifically what is zone 2?
Yeah, so zones, I mean, gosh, depending on who you ask, you'll probably get a different answer, not only in how the zones are defined, but probably in also how many zones there are, how much you should train in each particular zone. There's so much nuance. And I think, what you and I are going to talk about today, and I think we'll help kind of clear some of that up and maybe give people an idea of like, it's very nuanced, but it doesn't have to be, and running can kind of be simple, which I think is a great conclusion. So when we talk about training zones, we're basically talking about, I guess I'll back up a little, and I don't even like the word zones because it makes it seem like when we train, there are these very distinct like physiological buckets. Like, well, if I'm at this pace, I'm in zone 1. If I'm at this pace, I'm in zone 2. And like we neatly kind of pass over each threshold into each zone, when in reality, when we're running or cycling or doing whatever type of endurance activity, it's a spectrum. If you increase your intensity a little bit, your body is using fuel in a different way. But it doesn't just automatically say, at 7 minutes per mile, I'm burning 50% carbs, 50% fat. Once I hit 645 per mile, I'm burning 100% fat. Your body just doesn't switch from carb burning to fat burning. It is a spectrum. But the zones, as physiologists and coaches, you have to use things to prescribe training intensity and training distribution. So what we do is use zones. And these are areas of, training intensity that you want to train in to achieve a particular goal. And so there are 3-zone models, there are 5-zone models, and then there are 7-zone models. I would say the most common is the 5. Sometimes 7 is used with, say, like elite professional cyclists, maybe even runners, because it adds 2 of these like super maximal kind of intensities on there. And then the 3-zone model, which I kind of like, is, anybody can use it, but maybe more kind of geared towards like recreational. You have your like easy, moderate, and hard. And, we won't define each of the zones and all of those kind of models because that could probably take us to, midnight and we'll miss dinner. But I think that what people should understand about them is, yes, there are these zones that correspond to different physiological events in the body. And maybe we'll talk about what some of those are, things like lactate, breathing rate, heart rate. And, you train in those zones again to achieve a desired training outcome. So for zone 2, for example, everybody hears about that because you want to get better at burning fat or improve your mitochondrial capacity. If you do zone 5 or maybe even 6 or 7, that's if you want to get, maximize your power output, maximize your aerobic fitness or your VO2 max, increase your, anaerobic speed. I'll put anaerobic in quotes because that's another word I'm not a huge fan of. But zones are great because they give us a goal. They give us a way to train. If we didn't have zones, we would just kind of go out there willy-nilly and run and cycle and not really know what to do. Zones give us a way to prescribe training and, based on different intensities and what our specific goals are.
And I think you've kind of captured what I was hoping to get at here, which is basically let's try and make this the sort of TLDR summary of zone talk. We don't need to be splitting hairs about what percentage of lactate threshold or heart rate is entering from zone 3 into zone 4. I think we need to figure out for recreational runners like me, basically where is zone 2 and what's it mean and what do these other zones mean and how do we measure it?
Yeah, I think that, so let's just talk, get into maybe zone 2 specifically. And I think, Thomas, it's pretty timely that we're having this conversation because last week there was a paper that was published. It was not like a randomized controlled trial, but it was basically this expert consensus review. I think 14 sports scientists, coaches, physiologists, they were all questioned on how do you define zone 2? what specific adaptations should people expect from zone 2, and then like how should athletes train zone 2? What are the best workouts for it? So it was a nice, easy kind of read, but it really sought to distill these nuanced views about zone 2, come up with a consensus definition that people can use. And I really like it because it's very practical. It gets into jargon like lactate thresholds, ventilatory thresholds, and things like that. But the way that they define it, and they actually define it in sort of like 5 or 6 different ways. So most commonly, I think, when people are thinking about zone 2, they think heart rate. What percent of my maximal heart rate am I training at? And so they kind of define zone 2 as, I think a easier way to think about it, 70 to 80% of maximal heart rate. They kind of provide this wider range, 67 to 82%. But I think if people are thinking about it, 70 maybe to 80% of maximal heart rate. You'll hear a lot of people say even lower though, so something like 60 to 70. So I would even broaden kind of that range and start at 60, 80. If you're a very trained athlete, your zone 2 might be at 80% of your maximal heart rate, but for recreational runners, it's going to hover somewhere between that, like around that 70% of your maximal heart rate.
Okay, cool.
Before going on to the other stuff, that introduced. Yeah. Okay.
I think it'd be good. Let's just zoom out and why do people actually want to do? What are the benefits of zone 2? Why would we focus so much on zone 2? And maybe why has it become so popular? But I guess, why are we talking about zone 2 so much? Why?
Sure.
What's good about it?
I love that question. Let's zoom out a little bit. So what are the benefits, the proposed benefits, and both the study benefits of zone 2? So, like I said before, it's supposed to, and it does, but improve your aerobic base. We've all heard of why we need this large aerobic base. If you think of your training kind of fitness as a pyramid, your base is your foundational training, develops your mitochondria, your type 1 slow twitch muscle fibers, all of your enzymes. You need that base, your aerobic fitness base, your VO2 max, to kind of support all the training above that, which is, higher intensity stuff. So if you improve your base, you get better at, all the intensities above the base or faster than that. So improving your aerobic base is going to allow you to become not only able to run further, but run at the same speed with less effort and potentially run at faster speeds. So you're just going to become a better runner. I mean, you need to do zone training if you want to run faster. Run slow to run fast is kind of the zone 2 mantra, I think. And obviously there's some truth to that because you can't just do fast running all the time. You'll risk injury. For newer runners, especially who don't have a history of 10, 20, decades of training, you really do need to take time to develop your aerobic energy systems before you really start to kind of practice race pace stuff. And zone 2 training does all that. It does that by increasing the number of capillaries in your body. So it improves blood vessel health, new blood vessels, increases your mitochondria. So your energy powerhouses, everybody kind of knows what those are, but improves your mitochondrial content, improves your fat oxidation capacity. And again, therefore just supports your aerobic energy systems. Does it directly improve, say, your zone 3, zone 4, and zone 5? Maybe not directly, but again, indirectly by allowing you to train harder and have a more developed aerobic system.
Okay, cool. I think we can get into where we maybe measure and define the lower and upper limits of zone 2. But first, it might be interesting to discuss what the implications are if we are training lower than zone 2 and higher than zone 2. So are we sacrificing something if we're, zone 2 is notorious for backing off and taking it easy. If we go too slow and we're into zone 1, let's say, is there something we're losing? And if we go into zone 3 and tip into zone 4, what are we sacrificing there?
Yeah, so I guess we can start with if you're going lower than that. I don't necessarily think that you're sacrificing anything, but say if you want to achieve the same benefit of zone 2 training, but you're going to do like zone 1 type of stuff, you're just going to have to spend a lot of time doing that. So, you could go out on a 90-minute zone 2 run. Well, if I want to do lower intensity than that, zone 1, I may have to go out for 3 or 4 hours. And I guess that's, you can draw a similar analogy to, why some people find high intensity interval training to be so attractive is because you can get the same benefits or similar benefits as zone 2 in less time. So you go more intense, you have to spend less time at that intensity to get the same adaptation. But of course, sacrifices, as you mentioned, come with all of those. If you go slower than zone 2, you have to spend a ton of time. It's not as efficient. And if you go higher than that, you risk overdoing it, overtraining, injury risk if you're a runner. So that's why you need to find the nice balance. I wouldn't say, again, I think if balanced correctly, and if, you prescribe the right kind of training distribution, I don't necessarily think that there are sacrifices to going one way or the other. I do think maybe there are a few sacrifices to going lower, because at some point, if you want to become a better runner, you can't just go out and walk at a brisk pace all day. I mean, you really need to practice running. And there's a biomechanical aspect too. I know we're talking about kind of physiology and, cardiovascular stuff, but running at a very slow pace, Thomas, I'm sure like it sometimes can feel pretty uncomfortable. I mean, my typical run pace is around 7 minutes per mile. If I go run 9.5 minutes per mile, it just feels weird. I'm like, this isn't doing anything for me. I'm like, you're jogging. And so there's an aspect to practicing the biomechanics at that zone 2 where I think everything kind of clicks. Everybody will know that pace where they just feel, oh, this feels good. I could do this all day. So you get that with the zone 2 training, and I think that can help you work on efficiency. So you become a more efficient runner by doing zone 2. What you risk then by, I think, going faster in your zone 3 and 4 is, your biomechanics start to change a little bit, and that's where your injury risk can pop up. That's, again, part of the reason we don't spend a ton of time there.
I want to get into this because it feels like with 80-20 running and then really zone 2 and HIIT becoming much more popular, that the stuff in the middle, the zone 3 and the zone 4, is getting called junk miles or the gray zone. It's getting a bad rep. Is there space for that in your training program, in my training program?
I think so. Polarized training is popular, and that's, the idea of let's just basically do zone 2 and zone 5. So we're going to do only low intensity or pretty much, VO2 max type stuff. I think the concept or the idea of calling 3 and 4, those zone 3 and 4 junk miles, is just completely ludicrous. And in fact, I think I get a lot of benefit of training in those zones. Personally, speaking personally, but I think other people can gain a benefit as well. Those are like those zones you think of as the threshold zones. So, you go out and do, say, a tempo run or a threshold run where, you're not really, exhausted at the end, but it's not something you can sustain all day, but it feels hard, and it's kind of, you can carry on. It's like your half marathon pace, maybe your marathon pace even. I think there's a ton of benefit to training there, not only in becoming more efficient, but also, pushing that ceiling of kind of your VO2 max, because you're edging on the VO2 max type training. But then again, it's not as stressful as the zone 5. So you're closer to zone 2, and therefore you're kind of not maybe risking just going all out. Your autonomic nervous system is fatigued and doing that all the time. So I'm a huge fan of, obviously, the polarized training, and it works for a lot of people, but certainly not junk miles in zones 3 to 4. You're getting a lot of fat oxidation in those zones. You're improving your mitochondria probably even a little bit more than you would in zone 2. So I think those training zones can be very beneficial as well, for sure.
And I guess the argument for going into zone 2 as opposed to those zones is you can just add more volume, recover quicker. One of the main argument, I guess, recover quicker. Yeah, you can just bag more miles, right?
Totally. Yeah. I think,
reducing injury risk.
Yeah. And, that's one of the nuances that often doesn't get talked about in these conversations. I think we take data from elite athletes in their polarized training and say, this is where the whole 80-20, model comes in, right? Oh, well, let's look at these Tour de France cyclists who are doing 30 hours per week of endurance training, 80% at, very low intensity, 20% at high. Well, I don't know about you, Thomas, but, I run a fair amount, but I didn't certainly not putting in 25 to 30 miles a week of training, and nor are most people who are probably going to be listening to this. And so in that case, does the 80-20 apply linearly across everyone? I don't think so. I think that the less you do, kind of the more room you have to play around with those zones, maybe 3 and 4, or even add a bit more on the, in the zone 5. So that's where kind of the context sometimes gets lost, I think. But, it's not to say that that's a bad prescription, but, I think everyone likes to just shout 80-20, this is what all the elites do, therefore this is what I should do. And, I don't know if that's necessarily the case across the board.
Yeah, we get it a lot. We get a lot of emails about this. But let me ask you. Actually, another email we get very frequently is, "Hey, I'm trying to do this zone two stuff, but my heart rate's just too high." They'll be using their Garmin or their Apple Watch or whatever, and they'll get going, and it's somebody it's not a beginner runner necessarily. It's just somebody that wants to train themselves in zone two, but it's frustrating because they need to keep stopping to walk. What would your advice be to somebody that's experiencing that?
Yeah, my advice would be is to walk and kind of embrace that because eventually you're going to work up to be able to do a continuous zone two session. So I think that we often think of intervals when we're runners and we think, oh, they have to be high intensity. Well, you can do zone two intervals. So say for instance, and heck, I do this if I ever, knock on wood, have to come back from an injury or something like that, which has fortunately, been a while since I've had to do that, but I'll do a walk run. So I'll run for 3 minutes and then I'll walk for 1 minute. Then I'll run for 3 minutes and walk for 1 minute. And I'll alternate that. And I think people who are having a hard time staying in zone two, and I assume that they're probably using their heart rate, will run at your zone two pace until your heart rate creeps out of that zone, and then walk until you go back down, I would say, until you go below maybe the lower barrier of your zone two, and then start to run again until you kind of creep up and you're almost out of zone two, and then stop to walk again. Eventually, your intervals are going to be longer. So you're able to say, just run for 3 minutes. Then maybe next week you can do 5 minutes. The next week you can do 7. Eventually you're going to be able to do 60 minutes all in zone two at that pace. So do not fear walking and just think of this as an interval workout. Don't think of walking as walking. Think of it as zone one running. Maybe reframe it and it sounds a lot better. But yeah, embrace the walk and feel free to do that. You can structure your interval workouts where you're going to be in zone two and zone one the entire time. And just think of those walk breaks as recovery intervals, basically, between your zone two.
Yeah, I think there's almost that, and I had a bit of this last year. There's almost an attitude adjustment needed because a lot of runners who haven't been used to tracking their heart rates are used to going for a run and feeling like they've worked out. They've got a workout out of it at the end. And when you do zone two, you can sometimes be out for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and you come home and you feel like you could keep going. And then your watch is you're going up a hill and your watch is telling you got to slow down and walk, and it can be frustrating. So I think sometimes when people embark on their zone two journey, they're not aware that sometimes it can actually be frustrating.
Yeah, it definitely can. And again, I think one of the perils, perhaps, of having access to all of this data, like heart rate monitors, is that heart rate is useful, but, your zone two heart rate might not be someone else's zone two heart rate. Like we discussed using the example at the beginning, my zone two heart rate probably creeps up, honestly, 80, maybe even, low 82% of my maximal heart rate. I'm still in zone two. Whereas someone else, they might not be able to go above 65% until they're at zone two. And so this is where I think that constantly, people looking at their watch when they're on a run can be a downside because, okay, well, you're going up a hill, maybe just continue your effort up that hill. You don't need to, slow down, or maybe just, I think going off perceived effort sometimes to use zone two can be just as valuable versus heart rate, because while your heart rate might say 70%, well, that doesn't mean your physiology is out of zone two. If we go, maybe you looked at your lactate levels, they might not actually be in zone two, even though your heart rate is experiencing a temporary spike. There's, you can get into the weeds on all of that, but I just think, it can be frustrating, and heart rate is a fantastic guide. But a lot of the times if people are, asking me, this goes kind of to that 3-zone model, the easy, medium, and hard, does this feel very hard? Can you hold a conversation? Okay, well, you're probably in zone two if it feels moderate and you're talking to your buddy next to you.
So this is good. This is getting to my next point, which is so many of the runners I just know socially, and myself and my girlfriend who's training for her first half marathon, we're interested in this stuff. We go running, maybe wearing a Garmin or an Apple Watch, and these things tell you which zone you're in based on wrist-based heart rate monitors, right? Now, I know we could get into continuous glucose monitors or whatever it is, but 90% of us aren't going to get into that stuff. So I'm quite interested for regular runners, for beginner and intermediate runners, how good is the data we're getting from our wrist-based heart rate monitors? Should we be going for chest straps? What do you usually recommend?
If you are serious about really using your heart rate and you want high quality data, I think you need to get a chest strap. I have a chest strap. I also have been lately wearing an armband, so it goes around my bicep. Koros makes one of those. I think a few other brands do. That's still, it's a little bit more comfortable, but what it adds in comfort, I think it maybe sacrifices in a little bit of accuracy. So I think maybe slightly more accurate than the wrist-based, but certainly not as accurate as the chest strap. So if you want high quality data and you're going to use that to prescribe your training, I think you need to invest in a chest strap. There's a ton of variability with the wrist-based devices. At rest, they're accurate. If you want your overnight resting heart rate, I think they're perfectly accurate for that. But what I find for myself, and I think what other people, who are kind of experts in the tech of the wristwatches will tell you, is that as you run faster, depending on maybe the environmental conditions, if it's cold, they're going to give you different readings. So I find that, with the wrist, highly less effective if I'm running at my marathon or half marathon pace compared to, say, I'm just out for an easy jog. And unfortunately, that means that sometimes during races, I don't get great accurate data, which I don't really like, which is sort of why I invested in that armband, hoping to get maybe a little more accurate data. Nobody wants to wear a chest strap during a race. That's just a little bit distracting. So yes, I tell everybody pretty much invest in a heart rate strap. I mean, they're less than $100. That's, it's half of a pair of shoes, and they last a long time. It's never really going to wear out. It'll last you a couple years at least. You got to change the battery, but just invest in one of those. Not only is it fun to have, but it'll just give you accurate data. So I would really, really, really suggest that.
Okay, and what about more intuitive means of measuring whether or not you're in zone 2? And obviously this isn't going to be exact, but I think you've mentioned RPE already and sort of conversational pace. What can regular runners take from that?
Yeah, I think a couple other things that people can use. One more thing about heart rate, though, I think, before I move on, is that make sure if you are going to use, say, a chest strap or go by whatever your watch is saying based on zones, make sure you program what your actual maximal heart rate is into your watch. Most of these, if you just buy it and start using it out of the box, it's going to set those zones based on your age predicted maximal heart rate. Most often the 220 minus your age, which is wildly variable, wildly inaccurate. Do not use it. So, I think if a lot of people might not know what their true max heart rate is, but if you've ever raced a 5K, just look at what your heart rate was at the very end of that 5K, and maybe that'll give you a good idea. If you really want to figure it out, go to a lab, do a VO2 max test, or go to a track and run a progressively hard mile where you're running all out on that last lap and try to get your maximal heart rate. Those are kind of some field tests to do it. But really, you should know what your max heart rate is through experience, not using some algorithm from a watch. Please don't do that. So that would be my advice. So back to these kind of more intuitive measures then. Obviously, most people aren't going to be using lactate. I think continuous lactate monitors hopefully will soon become a thing. And I think after that, we're all going to be spinning with data during our runs, which I don't know if it's a good or a bad thing. But you can use perceived exertion. And for this one, I think, you can do a scale of 1 to 10, but most people have probably, or at least familiar with something called the Borg rating of perceived exertion scale. And that goes from 6 to 20. That provides a little more range. So I think it can be kind of accurate. So you can use that to measure your zones. And if you're going to do zone 2, based on kind of the Borg RPE scale, you're going to be somewhere around, I would say, a 12 to maybe a 15, and that goes up to 20. So zone 2 and then zone 3, 4 are going to be like 16, 17, zone 5, 18, 19, kind of 20-ish. But yeah, rating of perceived exertion. And again, you don't even have to do a rating yourself. Just think, how hard does this feel? Could I do this for 2 more hours? If the answer is yes, then you're probably in zone 2. One of my favorites is something called the talk test. And so, maybe you're running alone, but maybe you're running with someone. But either way, you could basically, if you're holding a conversation similar to what you and I are doing now, maybe you have to take a breath in between every other sentence or so. Yeah. Then you're probably in zone 2. I love the talk test. I think that's one of kind of the more accurate measures of effort. And so, yeah, I think using that, combining it with RPE, ultimately, I think that is the key, right? Let's use heart rate, let's use your RPE, and let's use the talk test on any one run to assess it. So I think combining all of those is kind of going to give you a net average of what your effort is. So I'm a huge fan of that approach.
And I think the truth is, I found, if you're gonna try this stuff for a while, you can use the chest strap, you can get dialed in, but then once you get a feel for it, like I'll go out running and I just know I'll do a zone 2 run. And I don't check my heart rate during the run, I kind of tune out, but then at the end I'll check the stats, and it 95% of the time it's been in zone 2, just because you just get a feel for it, right? I don't know if you're in the same boat there.
Oh yeah, I think once you've run long enough, I mean, if you were to ask me on any single run, like at any point in the run, what's your heart rate right now, I could probably tell you within plus or minus 5 beats per minute. But again, that comes with time. And so I think that, I say using all of these subjective measures, I do think that initially, so if we're talking about newer runners who are trying to decide what to use, I think using RPE and the talk test can be, or maybe probably the talk test can be maybe a little bit more accurate. As you become a better runner, maybe then using RPE is a little bit better, because if you're new, everything's kind of going to seem hard maybe. So even during zone 2, you might think, oh my gosh, this is like, I might be in zone 3 or zone 4. Reality, you might be in zone 2, you just need a little more experience running. So give yourself time, and then you can kind of use the RPE. But when you're starting out, maybe the talk test, maybe using heart rate, those might be better options for newer runners.
Okay, so let's put ourselves in the shoe of a newer runner who has discovered this zone 2 concept. And I know it depends on so many factors, but how would you advise them to start to implement it? And in terms of distance or the time they should spend in zone 2, whether as percentage of their weekly mileage or the length of individual runs, in order to get those benefits?
Yeah, so I think that in terms of prescribing, say, how much you should run per week or how much time you should spend running, that's going to be hard to just give a blanket recommendation, because everybody's starting at a different journey. I do think that using some sort of distribution, though, could be probably a good idea. And again, I talked about how much I wasn't a fan of like the 80-20, but I think like an 80-20 or even 70 kind of 30 breakdown would be a solid approach. And I also often think that the 80-20s can sometimes get misconstrued as people thinking, oh, I need to spend 80% of my time per week in zone 2 and 20% in, say, zone 5 or the higher zones. What initially that was meant to refer to is actually the number of sessions per week. So based on an 80-20, say, rule, if I'm a newer runner, even if I'm an experienced runner, say you're doing 5 training sessions per week, 4 of those should be low intensity, 1 of those should be high intensity. I think that would be a great approach for anybody if they're starting out. Do 4 easy sessions per week, 1 hard session per week. And as you maybe get a little bit more experienced, maybe then switch that to you're doing 3 easy sessions per week and 2 hard sessions per week. That's what most trained runners will do. They'll have an interval workout and then maybe a long run workout per week. But they're also maybe training, 6 or 7 times a week as opposed to 5. So modify that based on how many days you want to run per week. I use 5 just because, I feel like most people might be running 4 or 5 times per week. If you're doing that, make one of those high intensity, try implementing some zone 2 strategies for the other ones. And I think, what some of those strategies might be, one which we already talked about, is the zone 2 intervals. I think that's a perfect way to start. Just calculate, what your zone 2 heart rate should be. A lot of the watches now will program it in there. And that's, I think, a fun way to use technology. Program your zone 2. You can even program your watch to alert you if you go out of your zone 2. So if you set your range of 140 to 155 beats per minute, and anytime you stray out of that range, go too hard or even too easy, your watch is going to yell at you. So try that, and then go out on a run. And when you maybe go to the upper end of that heart rate, walk, and then, we already discussed kind of this, but I think that's a great approach. So zone 2 intervals, start out with that, just see how far you can go, and then progressively increase each week.
One question we get is, can I just do all my training in zone 2? What am I going to get the same gains, or what am I missing out on? And I actually know quite a few maybe older runners who I would put in that camp. They just go out 5, 6, 7 times a week, and every run's an easy run. what would you say? I mean, what would you say to somebody who is at the beginner level but wants to improve?
Well, yeah. So for beginners, I think that you could do all of your runs per week in zone 2, and for a while you're going to get faster because you're just introducing a new training stimulus. And, you're not only introducing, say, more running, but then eventually you're just going to keep doing more volume. So I think that up to a point, and what that point is, I don't know, but you could just keep adding zone 2 intensity, and you will probably become a better runner. Probably even at 5K, 10K, half marathon, you'll get faster. But I think that what you're sacrificing is that at a certain point, you're going to plateau because you need to raise intensity to experience further gains. I mean, sure, I think you could add volume infinitely, just keep doing volume, but that's not practical for most people. I think most people will hit a period where they're, okay, I've kind of maximized how much time I can spend per week. So let's introduce this new variable of intensity. So yeah, I mean, if you're just training for fitness and you just want to be able to complete a marathon, get maybe faster if you're newer to it. Yeah, I think doing all your runs in zone 2, you could do it. Maybe add some strides so you get a little bit of fast running, but I don't see a problem to it. But you're certainly sacrificing something by not doing higher intensity training for sure. And if you want to be faster and set a personal best or a personal record, eventually you're going to have to run more intensely.
Yeah, it's been interesting watching this because more, there. I would say it's fairly accepted that an almost pyramidal or what was the term you used? Polarized approach is probably the best for almost everybody, whether you're recreational or sub-elite or elite. And it's just been interesting to see this zone 2 term come up. I don't know, maybe in the last only 2 years, really. It's maybe it's just been with the proliferation of wearables that now we can all easily get some measure of our heart rate, whether it's accurate or not. So then this is the same philosophy that a lot of coaches, a lot of runners have known for years, but now it's got this form that's adapted thanks to the technology that we now all have. I guess that's what I'm taking from this.
Yeah, I think so. I know. I wonder what the all zone 2 training would just be, like a rectangular approach as opposed to like a pyramidal or a polarized. I don't know what we should call it.
Flat.
Yeah. So I think, and it was funny because I think when this new consensus paper came out, there was, Inigo San Milan. He's kind of he coaches professional cyclists and Tour de France cyclists, and he's kind of I don't know, seems like he's like the godfather of zone 2. He's been talking about it forever, but he posted something in response to this paper coming out. He's like, we didn't really need this. Like, we've been using zone 2 for decades. We've all been talking about it, and he's right, but not among kind of the recreational runners has this term really been that popular. It's just risen to popularity. And so it's just funny because we've put a name to something that we've been doing for so long. I mean, it used to be called base running or long, slow distance or whatever you want to put it, but now it's zone 2 and it kind of has this fancy name to it. So I don't know. I don't necessarily think it is a bad thing. I think we do overanalyze a lot of things now because we're like always wondering if we're in zone 2. But again, I think if it helps people to train smarter, then it's not necessarily a bad thing that it's become so popular. One of the things though that I find interesting about it just personally is that it's almost used as like, newer runners often think running sucks because they're doing it too hard, which I think is sometimes often the case. But oddly enough, for more experienced runners, sometimes running easy is harder. And like, they love to run hard. It feels good. I mean, I don't necessarily enjoy, quote unquote, my zone 2 runs as much as I do my tempo or my threshold or my intervals, because you don't get that runner's high really from the zone 2, at least sometimes if you're more experienced, that you do during an interval workout. So zone 2 is kind of more, it's like the medicine that I'm getting during the week, and the high intensity training, the intervals, that's kind of really where, what I enjoy more so about running. And so it's kind of funny. I think these things differ sometimes between, maybe more experienced or recreational runners, but running fast it can be fun as well. So, I think you got to learn to embrace all these different intensities. You don't want to finish every run feeling like you couldn't have gone any further, because that's just a recipe for disaster and kind of not adapting. But I totally know what you mean where, if you go out on a run, you're like, oh my gosh, this is boring. I really wish I could pick up the pace because I'm not getting all the neurochemicals in my brain that I need to from running fast.
But I think what we've just covered is a pretty good reframing, because I think a lot of people hear zone 2 and see it as the latest philosophy, but it isn't. It's almost like underlining and confirming this body of evidence and the training philosophies that have built up over the years. And it's just the fact we've got this new technology probably has given it this form of putting it in a heart rate zone.
Yeah, I would say so. And the only other unfortunate thing, though, is that, when we really look at how do you define zone 2, it's kind of the lactate threshold and the ventilatory threshold is what should be used. But then, unfortunately, we have all this other technology, which is great that we're able to measure it, but it also means that we're not maybe accurately measuring zone 2. And I think that hits the point of what you and I are talking about today, Thomas, is like, in that case, that's why we shouldn't be so dogmatic and we shouldn't worry about it so much, and that you should kind of use RPE, because in reality, you have all these measures, but you might not actually be measuring whether you're in zone 2 or not. So it may not matter at the end of the day. And what really matters is that you're just doing some easy running and some hard running and putting in the effort and recovering enough and not stressing so much about being in zone 2, because you may not actually be, really measuring what you think you are.
Okay. We skipped over it at the start because I wanted to keep this, recreational runner friendly. But I do think you touched on something that we can close out with, which is the actual physiological barriers or signals around zone 2. Because we just spoke about the heart rate, but you touched on other factors. So maybe we could close out just by describing them, and it feels like we've completed the zone 2 talk.
Yeah, it'll come for full circle. So the key kind of two, I would call them, I don't know, maybe like physiological events, maybe that sort of demarcate zone 2, is one of them is known as the first lactate threshold, or LT1. And this is basically a point where if you were doing a test of progressively higher intensities, where your blood lactate would start to rise basically above a steady state. And so zone 2 is right below that. You're kind of pushing right up on the edge of that. So zone 2, your lactate levels are going to be steady. They're not really going to start to rise. They put numbers to it. So between 1 to 2 millimolar per liter, and that's just the concentration of blood lactate. In reality, again, that's going to differ a lot between people, maybe trained athletes or, just based on your individual physiology. But 1 to 2 millimolar of lactate, and it's below, or it's at a lactate steady state, below when your lactate initially starts to rise. LT1 is what that's known as. Yeah. Or ventilatory threshold 1, or VT1. And that's basically the point at which your breathing rate increases above, again, kind of just your baseline. Say something like 30 to 40 breaths per minute. But again, that's maybe variable, but just a noticeable increase in your breathing rate. Those are the two, I think, more physiological boundaries that would be used for zone 2. And so below those two, below LT1 or VT1, that's zone 2. And that's kind of what they're going to use if they're really speaking physiologically. Then we already went over heart rate, might be between 65, 75, maybe even up to 80% of your maximal heart rate. The Borg RPE scale, 9 to 12, on that 6 to 20 scale again. And then your breathing rate is consistent. Talk test, you could hold a conversation. Those are kind of all the ways that you could define it.
Yeah. I think I've told people before, if you feel like you're pushing, you're probably going too hard. If you can't have a conversation, you're probably going too hard. You can over quantify these things sometimes, but sometimes just having a simple rule keeps it easy.
I think so too. And I really do think, though, if a lot of people were to go and get a test, like there is zone 2, I don't think it's supposed to feel boringly easy. I mean, especially in trained athletes, like zone 2 can be pretty high. So it doesn't need to feel like, oh my gosh, this is incredibly easy. Like there's a little bit of intensity to zone 2. I think that most people realize, how wide that zone is for a lot of people is going to be different, but I don't think it's, it's not a literal or maybe even metaphorical walk in the park, I guess.
Cool. Brady, thank you very much. Talk to you again.
Yeah, Thomas, this was great. People understand zone 2 now and can go train smarter.